Diamonds do not remember where they have been. The women who carry them do. On the 30th of April, 2026, 19 tiaras entered one room in Stockholm. From the outside, the images looked like everything a royal occasion is supposed to look like. White tie, full decorations, candlelight and old stones. The accumulated grandeur of 2 centuries of European dynasties, gathered to honor a king turning 80. But look more carefully at what was actually in that room. A tiara that crossed an ocean in a handkerchief, pressed into the hands of a mother's daughter on a railway platform in wartime, with instructions to sell it stone by stone if the money ran out. A tiara that left Russia inside a child's doll, carried across a border in 1917 by a small girl who did not know what she was holding. A tiara that sat in a vault through 40 years of communism, held by someone in some unnamed place, against the possibility that things might one day change. And in the corner of the room, wearing the smallest tiara present, a woman who was born in 1938. The same year her mother wore that very tiara to the same kind of dinner for a different Swedish king 88 years before. These objects were not decorating the room, they were its memory. Before you look at the light they throw, consider the darkness they have passed through to get here. King Carl Gustaf of Sweden was born on the 30th of April, 1946. On the evening of the 30th of April 2026, he turned 80 years old, and the people he gathered around him were not a diplomatic guest list. They were his family, his cousins, the royal houses he is bound to by blood going back 2 centuries. Because this was a reunion rather than a state occasion, more of the foreign jewels worn that evening carried explicit Swedish provenance than at any comparable gathering in living memory. The Norwegian emerald parure had been Queen Josephina's. The Baden Palmette tiara had been Queen Victoria of Sweden's. The diamond bracelet worn as a tiara by the Queen of Denmark had been Queen Louise's. The guests did not arrive in spite of Swedish history. They arrived carrying it on their heads. The dress code was white tie with full decorations, the strictest in Europe, and then the tiaras began to arrive. Queen Sylvia closed the procession in red. On her head sat the Braganza tiara, made in France around 1829, set with more than 1,000 diamonds arranged in flowers and leaves. It weighs 1.45 kilograms. Jewellery historians consider it one of the most physically demanding tiaras in any European royal vault to actually wear. The weight is not distributed evenly, and it requires the wearer to hold her head at a specific angle to prevent it pulling to one side. When Sylvia wore it for her first official portrait in October 1976, she required several sittings to learn how to manage it. She has said so herself. A modern recreation using comparable diamonds would, according to one specialist consulted in early 2026, enter the 8-figure range. She has worn it in public on 4 occasions in 50 years. The state visit of Queen Elizabeth II in 1983, the wedding of Crown Princess Victoria in 2010, the King's Golden Jubilee banquet in 2023, and now this. The tiara did not begin in Sweden. It was made as a wedding gift from Emperor Pedro I of Brazil to his second wife, Princess Amalie of Leuchtenberg, set with stones salvaged from the jewels of his first empress, Maria Leopoldina, who died in Rio de Janeiro in 1826. When the widowed Empress Amalie left it to her sister, Queen Josephina of Sweden and Norway, it traveled north by sea in 1873 aboard a Norwegian corvette called the Balder from Kristiansand to Stockholm. Every Swedish queen since has worn it. Sylvia's mother was Brazilian. Her name was Alice Suarez de Toledo. When Sylvia closes the procession at the most important dinner of the year, with the Braganza on her head, she is wearing, on top of everything else, the country her mother came from. 1.45 kilograms of it. She knows exactly what she is doing. Crown Princess Victoria arrived in cobalt blue. On her head sat the Contort diamond tiara, made in 1904 by E. Wolf and Company of London. 5 forget-me-not garlands of diamonds, with detachable drops hanging between them. It was made for Princess Margaret of Connaught for her marriage in 1905 to the future King Gustaf VI Adolf of Sweden. Margaret died in 1920, aged 38, of complications following ear surgery. The Swedish Prime Minister announced that the ray of sunshine at Stockholm Palace had gone out. The tiara passed to Margaret's son, then to his wife, Princess Sibylla. Sibylla wore it so consistently through the decades that within the family, it is simply called Princess Sibylla's tiara. Sibylla died in November 972, less than a year before her son became King Carl XVI's Gustaf. She never saw him reign. By choosing the Connaught for her father's 80th birthday, Victoria placed her grandmother in the room. A woman who never lived to see him on the throne was, for one evening, present at his table. This required no announcement, the tiara said it. Princess Christina wore the 6-button tiara, Its 6 diamond rosettes once adorned the coronation crown of King Carl XIV Johann, the Bernadotte dynasty's founder, in 1818. They had been added by him to a Renaissance crown made for King Eric XIV in 1561. Queen Victoria of Sweden ordered the rosettes removed in 1909, intending to mount them on a tiara frame. She died before the work was finished. The piece sat in the palace vaults for decades, undocumented. Inventories taken around the king's 1976 wedding rediscovered it. By wearing the 6-button, Christina wore the dynasty itself. A piece assembled from a crown made in 1561, reworked in 1818, dismantled in 1909, rediscovered in 1976, and placed on a woman's head in 2026. 465 years of Swedish kingship reduced to 6 diamond buttons. At a table nearby, Queen Sonja of Norway wore the emerald parure tiara. A massive square-cut emerald anchored its center, the grandest jewels in the Norwegian royal vault. It had been to Stockholm before, not on a happy occasion. August 1940, Stockholm Central Station. Crown Princess Märtha of Norway had 3 children with her on the platform. Ragnhild was 8, Astrid was 7. Harald, the youngest, was 3. They were leaving for the United States. Norway had been under German occupation since April. There was no date at which any of them expected to return. Märtha's mother, Princess Ingeborg, came to the station to see them off. Before the train departed, Ingeborg pressed a parcel into her daughter's hands. It was wrapped in a handkerchief. Inside was the Norwegian emerald parure, the tiara, the necklace, the earrings, the most valuable thing the family owned, outside the palace walls. Ingeborg's instruction was specific and practical. Use it as life insurance. If the family ran out of money in exile, sell it, piece by piece, for whatever it would bring. Märtha took the parcel onto the train. The children settled beside her. The train left Stockholm. Ingeborg stood on the platform and watched it go. She did not know whether she would see her daughter again. She did not know whether the war would end in a year or a decade. She did not know that Märtha would return in 1940, that Norway would be free by then, that the parcel would come back still wrapped, that not a single stone would ever be sold. She gave away the most valuable thing her family owned without knowing any of that. The handkerchief was not a ceremony. It was not a ritual of transfer or a formal act of inheritance. It was a practical object used by a mother standing on a railway platform in a war, with no certainty of outcome, making the only decision she could think to make. Märtha never sold it. When she returned to Norway in 1945, the emerald parure came with her. She wore it at state occasions through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. She died in 1954, 46 years old, 9 years before her son Harald would become king. She died still carrying what her mother had pressed into her hands on that platform, never knowing that the story of what had been given to her would one day be told in rooms like the one where it sat, on the 30th of April, 2026, around a woman's neck. Ingeborg died in 1958. By then the war was 13 years past, the parcel long returned, the emerald safe in Oslo. She would have known by then that it was never sold, but she had not known that when she gave it away. The emerald parure was never sold. But the woman who wrapped it in a handkerchief never knew that. On the other side of Europe, 23 years before the platform in Stockholm, a different woman had made a different calculation. Petrograd, 1917. Grand Duchess Victoria Fyodorovna, known to her family as Ducky, was preparing to leave Russia. The revolution had turned St. Petersburg into Petrograd and was in the process of turning Petrograd into something she could not predict and did not intend to remain inside. She had 2 daughters. Maria Kirillovna was the elder. Kira Kirillovna was younger. Both were children. Ducky took her jewels apart and distributed them through the luggage. What could not be hidden in cases was placed inside the children's belongings. The Greek Key Tiara, given to her by her husband, Grand Duke Cyril, on their marriage in 1905, geometric and spare, its clean lines carrying a quality that would later be called Art Deco before Art Deco had a name. It went into a doll. A small girl crossed the border from Russia into Finland carrying a doll with a diamond tiara inside it. The family made their way west. By around 1920, the tiara had reached Queen Marie of Romania. Through the networks of blood and obligation, the revolution had not entirely severed. On the 30th of April 2026, it sat on the head of Margareta, custodian of the Crown of Romania. It is the only major Romanian royal tiara not sold at auction. When the communist government came to power in 1947 and removed the royal family from their country, someone made a decision to hold on to it. That decision was made again, presumably, each year for 4 decades, by people whose names are not recorded and whose reasoning is not documented. They held on to it anyway. It outlasted the government that had made them hide it. There is a kind of loss that is harder to name than grief. It does not arrive in a single moment. It accumulates in the space between what happened and what the person who made it happen was never given the chance to know. Merthyr died without knowing whether anyone would remember the handkerchief, or the platform, or what it had cost her mother to stand there and watch the train leave. Ingeborg died not knowing what her daughter had felt, carrying that parcel across an ocean for 5 years, keeping it whole, never selling it. They never had an evening quiet enough to compare what each of them had carried. The tiara outlived them both. This is not a comforting observation, it is simply a true one. Objects do not grieve. They do not carry the weight of what was surrendered for them. They sit in vaults, they cross borders in handkerchiefs and in children's toys, and they appear at birthday dinners 86 years later, and they do not know the difference between any of it. The women know the difference. Merthyr never told her mother that she had not sold it. 3 threads ran through the riksal on the evening of the 30th of April. Nobody named them. They did not require naming. The first belonged to the emerald parure, Stockholm 1940, carried onto a train in a handkerchief, across the Atlantic through the years of exile, back to Oslo in 1945, and then, 86 years after it left, back to the city where Ingeborg had last held it. The station has been rebuilt twice. The platform no longer exists in the form it took that morning in August 1940. But the stones were in Stockholm again. The second belonged to the Greek Key Tiara, St. Petersburg 1905, a wedding gift. Petrograd 1917, pressed into a doll. Romania around 1920. 40 years of communism, held in some unnamed place by people whose names are not in any record. Bucharest after 1989. Stockholm 2026, on the head of a woman whose title was custodian rather than queen. Because the country she was custodian of had dissolved her family's claim in 1947 and taken 77 years to finish acknowledging what it had done. The thread did not form a clean loop, but it held. The third thread was the quietest, and it sat in the corner of the room where the cameras did not linger. A pearl and diamond floral tiara, maker unrecorded, date of manufacture unknown. Worn by Elsa von Rosen to a birthday dinner for King Gustaf V of Sweden in 1938. Kept in the family through 88 years that contained, among other things, a world war, the end of several European empires, and the ordinary, unremarkable passage of time. Worn by Madeleine Kogovinas, Elsa's daughter, to a birthday dinner for King Carl XVI Gustaf of Sweden in 2026. Madeleine was born in 1938. Her father was Prince Carl Bernadotte, the king's uncle, which made her the king's first cousin, which placed her, by connection if not by protocol, at the edge of the family table. She held no title that would appear in a history book. She was not in any line of succession. She was simply there, as she had been, in one sense, since the year of her birth, carrying without effort or announcement the longest unbroken thread in the room. She sat in a room full of queens and wore the smallest tiara present. It had survived nothing more dramatic than time. Time is not nothing. King Carl XVI's Gustaf, in his speech that evening, said that looking back at 80 was a form of reflection, that he was grateful for the life his family had built together, for the years of making something meaningful and lasting. His daughter Victoria described her father's example of service as a considerable responsibility, but also a joy and an honor. He did not mention the tiaras. He did not need to. His wife had worn 145 kilograms of diamonds that had crossed the Atlantic from Brazil 150 years ago. His daughter had worn the tiara of a grandmother who never saw him reign. Across the table, his first cousin sat with a small pearl tiara on her head that had been in this same kind of room, on her mother's head, 88 years before she was born. The jewels did not decorate the occasion. They were its argument. That something can be given in a moment of absolute uncertainty, passed through hands that will not live to see the outcome, held by people whose names will not be remembered, and still arrive, still intact, still worn. There were 19 tiaras in that room on the 30th of April 2026. The Norwegian emerald parure tiara, never sold. Last nearly sold, August 1940, platform of Stockholm Central Station, wrapped in a handkerchief, handed to a woman boarding a train to exile, with instructions to break it apart if the money ran out. The Greek Key Tiara, last public appearance before 2026, 1947. Means of removal from Russia in 1917. The hollow interior of a child's doll, in the arms of a small girl crossing a border who did not know what she was carrying. A pearl and diamond floral tiara, maker unknown. Worn twice at the same kind of dinner, 88 years apart, by a mother and then her daughter. None of them were sold when selling would have been reasonable. None of them disappeared when disappearing would have been easy. All of them came back. Queen Sylvia has said that the Braganza tiara is heavy, that it is complicated and unwieldy, and that there are occasions on which she is not certain she can manage the weight of it. She wears it anyway. 4 times in 50 years on the occasions she is judged important enough to ask that of herself. This is what legacy actually requires. Not sentiment, not ceremony, not the clean narrative of sacrifice and reward that makes for a satisfying ending. It requires the simple, repeated, entirely voluntary decision to keep carrying what was given to you, without knowing whether it matters, without any assurance that the person who gave it to you will ever know what you chose to do with it. Madeleine Kogovinas is not a queen. She is not a crown princess. She is the king's first cousin, born in the year her mother wore the same small tiara to the same kind of table. She sat at that table in 2026, and she was, by any reasonable measure, the most quietly remarkable person in the room. Not because of what she wore, because of how long she had been carrying it. Every person watching this has something like that. A piece of jewellery from a grandmother, a watch, a letter kept in a drawer, an object that passed through hands you loved before it passed through yours, and that you have not yet decided what to do with. You already know what the women in that room would tell you to do. Ingeborg stood on a platform in 1940 and gave away the most valuable thing her family owned. She gave it to a daughter who was leaving, in a war, with no fixed date of return and no certainty of outcome. Martha never had to sell it, but she never told her mother that. Which of those two facts is harder to sit with?